back to lecture number 71. This is historical topic 7.12, World War II mobilization. This topic is going to focus mostly on World War II on the home front, and our theme is social structures. The learning objective is explain how and why U.S. participation in World War II transformed American society. The first key concept is going to show a huge transformation because World War II is going to end the Great Depression. That's the key concept. The mass mobilization of American society helped end the Great Depression. It did so by implementing a total war strategy. So that means that the government is going to control the economy and they're going to set prices in order to be better able to win the war. So the War Production Board and the Office of Price Administration are created. They're going to set production goals and they're going to fix prices for consumers. So that way they are implementing an economy that is most efficient at providing the equipment necessary to fight the war. The government is going to use deficit spending to pay for all of the things that are going towards the war. And the deficit is going to go way up, even more compared to what was going on during the Great Depression when the New Deal was using deficit spending to try and spend their way out of the Depression. The GNP is going to go up 15 times, and by the end of the war, the United States is going to be the most prosperous nation in the world. Americans during the war are being asked to ration in order to feed the army and Europe. Several types of goods, whether they be food or consumer goods, were being rationed. So everyone had a set amount of things like sugar that they could buy and consume. Other goods that were being rationed were different types of clothing or material like nylon, because now those materials were to be used for government uniforms or military uniforms or military parachutes, because now paratroopers were a brand new type of military unit. In order to pay for all of this, the income taxes increased. This became constitutional through the 16th Amendment back in the 19-teens. And before, the income tax was only affecting the wealthiest people in America. Now the income tax is being spread out across all Americans. And by 1944, that income tax is going to be deducted automatically from people's paychecks, very similar to the way it is done now. And just like we had a Liberty Bond campaign in World War I, where there's going to be a war bond campaign that's going to raise over $100 million to pay for all of the equipment that goes into fighting the war. So the country's strong industrial base played a pivotal role in winning the war by equipping and provisioning allies and millions of U.S. troops. So the U.S. production made up for all of the weakened production in Europe. Because European cities were the targets of bombing raids, the ability for factories in Europe to continue to produce war machinery had become weak. And so in the United States, having been out of the conflict for so long, we still had our infrastructure to output war machines. And during the war, we increased that capacity. So we produce about 100,000 planes, 100,000 tanks. New ships are being turned out every 14 days, like in the Kaiser shipyards in Northern California. People are literally working around the clock. That they are working in overlapping shifts so that there is work being done on the ship at all hours of the day. And it became a competition and a source of pride for the workers that they could turn out a ship and complete it in just 2 weeks' time. There were agreements between labor and management to pause strikes during the war because any strike would create an interruption in the war machinery that was needed by American soldiers. In addition to this, Congress passes the Connolly Anti-Strike Act in 1943 over the veto of FDR. And it gives government permission to take over the operations of any industry or any company that is being threatened by a strike. This was not something that was unique. It had been done in the past. The first President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, had done this with the coal industry. But it was significant in that the government wanted to ensure that there were no interruptions in the war machine of the United States. You can see that there was also propaganda that was being put out in order to give the workers a sense of purpose, a sense of pride, that what they were doing at home was eventually going to be responsible for winning the war. All right, so there's new opportunities. Mobilization provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic positions for the war's duration, while also leading to debates over racial segregation. So about 5 million women came in to fill the labor gap that was created by men who went off to fight the war. The percentage of married women who entered the workforce rose about 24%. You may be familiar with the Rosie the Riveter image that was promoting women in the workplace. They were trying to get as many workers as possible, and you see images there, colored photographs of women working in these areas, and they're actually riveting the sides of, I think, planes in these pictures. For other minorities, you have American Indians who serve in the military. The United States Army had pioneered using Native American languages as a source of code to have radio back and forth without having the enemy know where troop positions were going to be. And in World War II, they used different Native American languages, especially the Navajo language, to try and develop a new code that could not be cracked by either Japanese or German spies. Mexican Americans are also being brought in as guest workers to help fill the labor gap, and they're working mostly in agricultural labor along the West Coast, but also up to the Midwest. Now, for Mexican Americans that were living in the United States during this time, they will experience some discrimination, and we see this in the Zoot Suit riots. A suit is a men's suit which is just really big and oversized, and this became a point of contention with the Mexican American community and especially service members stationed in Los Angeles, because the suit taking up so much fabric to create the look was seen as wasteful in a time of rationing. And so tensions escalated, and at some point there was a fight between some suiters and service members, and then this turned into American sailors going out across Los Angeles targeting anyone wearing a suit, regardless of them having been involved in the original violence. And as you can see in the picture on the left, they were stripped of their suits in public, they were humiliated, they were beaten up. And at the end of this, no service members were arrested for the violence, but the victims who had been beat up and who had been harassed are the ones who end up being arrested by the LA Sheriff's Department. All right, for racial segregation, we have the Double V campaign. This stands for Victory Over Fascism Abroad, and also Victory for Equality at Home. Now, African Americans served in World War II just like they had served in World War I, and they continued to be put into segregated units. We have a new civil rights group called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, formed in 1942. They will continue to be influential in the fight for civil rights into the 1960s and 70s. One of the co-founders, James Farmer, and the first director of CORE, will work closely with the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration later on in the 1960s, and also the Nixon administration. And one of the biggest gains for civil rights during the war is Executive Order 8802, and this is going to end discrimination in the defense industry. The picture on the bottom left gives you a little bit of an excerpt of what the order entails. He says, "I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. And I do hereby declare that it is the duty of employers and of labor organizations, in furtherance of said policy and of this order, to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin." So here, FDR is putting forth the fight for racial equality in terms of national security. And the executive order had been prompted by A. Philip Randolph's continued proposed march on Washington. So he was angry about the discrimination that African Americans were receiving, especially in business and industry. And finally, after enough prompting from Randolph and a light threat that he would get African Americans to march on the nation's capital, fighting for equality and asking for an end to discrimination, Roosevelt created this executive order to provide for a more equitable employment for African Americans. All right, so wartime experiences also generated challenges for civil liberties, such as the internment of Japanese Americans. Now, this happens under Executive Order 9066, issued out in 1942, and it puts close to 120,000 Japanese Americans in these internment camps. So all across the West Coast, Japanese Americans are seeing signs like the one that you see on the top left, giving them instructions that at a certain date they're all going to be transported to these internment camps, in which they fashioned into small towns in which they found work. They had newspapers. They had some sort of leisure time inside of the camps, but they could not leave. They were essentially prisoners in their own country. A lot of the times they were living in squalid conditions. Manzanar, one of the most famous camps, was at the foot of the eastern Sierras, where the temperatures can be quite extreme. As you can see in the bottom left, there it's Manzanar in the middle of a dust storm. And it can also reach really cold temperatures in the wintertime and reach really hot temperatures in the summertime. A lot of the times before they were transported, the temporary housing that they were made to live in before they were put on trains to be sent to these locations were also squalid in nature. Santa Anita Racetrack in Southern California was used as one of these temporary housing locations, and people literally had to sleep inside of the horse stalls before they could be sent off to one of these camps. The internment was challenged under the court case Korematsu versus the United States. Fred Korematsu was someone who tried to evade the internment, and then once he was finally caught, he sued the federal government. And the Supreme Court upheld the internment. They said that in times of war, the United States could put people in internment if they were posing a threat to national security. Well, in the 1980s, under new investigations, the Justice Department found that the U.S. government overplayed the threat that Japanese Americans actually posed, that there really was no threat to national security by allowing them to continue to live their lives. And so the people, those survivors who were still alive in the 1980s, were given some monetary compensation. However, the court case was not overturned. In 2019, the court case Hawaii versus Trump, which was over the travel Muslim ban under the Trump presidency, supposedly overturned it, but because that court case upheld the power of the federal government to keep people out of the country under a guise of national security, it's really unclear whether it actually overturned it. Some legal scholars still question that. If you want to read more about this, you can look up the graphic novel They Call Us Enemy by the actor George Takei. All right, so migration to the United States from Mexico and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere increased in spite of contradictory government policies towards Mexican immigration. So President Roosevelt had started the Good Neighbor policy in 1934, and it was supposed to stress non-intervention, meaning that the U.S. government is going to stay out of Latin America. They're not going to invade them as they had in the past to try and keep people in power who were more friendly to the United States. The Quota Acts did not restrict migration from the Western Hemisphere, so that meant that people from Latin America, Mexico, Central America could continue to go back and forth to the United States and their home country as seasonal workers, as the Braceros did starting in the 1940s. Now, the Braceros were guaranteed a minimum wage and adequate living conditions through the Bracero program, and it will continue about 20 years after the World War II is over, and in total, or per average, every year, about 200,000 Braceros would come to the United States under this program. All right, and that is it. So mobilization for World War II ended the Depression. That's one big way in which this mobilization changed American society. America's entry into the war became the lifeline for the European allies, and there were new job opportunities that opened up as men left to fight the war. Women, African Americans, Mexican Americans jumped up at these opportunities. Japanese internment was implemented as a war measure, and it was racially motivated, and we know this because German Americans were not targeted or were not interned. And finally, the Western Hemisphere immigration continued to increase during World War II. All right, thank you for sticking around, and please come back to lecture number 72.